So let me start by saying thank you very much, Marc, Dr. Applebaum, for agreeing to have this second conversation with me. We already have a conversation on the YouTube channel about phenomenology, about the natural attitude, and suspension of the natural attitude, which phenomenology promotes and cultivates. So I thought in this second conversation, we could take our discussions into a more specific domain, a more specific way of applying phenomenology, thinking about phenomenology, and also a domain that you have done some work on. You have a paper published in 2019 in the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, which is titled Remembrance, a Husserlian phenomenology of Sufi practice.
Right.
So let's explore some questions together about the phenomena of religion, religious experience, types of religious experience, and in general, why phenomenology of religion? Maybe we can start with that.
Wow. That probably brings us back to autobiography, actually. I mean, I suppose I could give a disciplinary answer to that, but it would be less authentic. I mean, to be maybe more serious, of course, there's plenty of reasons why, given how important religion and religious experiences just in human history and culture, there's plenty of reasons why, as human scientists, as practitioners of human science, whether that's anthropology, ethnography, psychology, why we would be interested in religious experience. I think there's plenty of good ground for that I probably don't need to go over. But personally, I think that the question of seeking and being available for, and then being interested from a qualitative research perspective on the meanings of experiences that could be described as religious experience has been part of my life since childhood. So that was already there for me prior to my getting an education that led me into phenomenology as a way of opening up and exploring the experiences of others and myself. So that's been there for me for a really long time. And I think the dialogue between experience as it's given prior to, or events, let's say, as they're given prior to reflection, and a reflective engagement with those events subsequently, and then the dialogue between those layers of ourselves, because I think the way an event is given and then interpreted, for phenomenology, we would say that an event that's impactful, and this is not restricted, of course, to so-called religious experience. It could be any important experience. For phenomenology, the way that an event like that is given to us, whether it's a car crash or the loss of a loved one or anything like that, is that there's the event itself, and then there's the way that that event is sedimented in our bodies, in our emotional, our physical, like these distinctions aren't, I don't want to overly formalize them, but our physical bodies, our emotional bodies, all of which is sort of pre-reflective or reflecting a kind of passive intentionality in phenomenological terms. And then the way in which we reflectively integrate or fail to integrate those experiences or make sense of them through reflection. So these are all these layers that, from a phenomenological perspective, we sort of carry along with us an event that's, so to speak, in the past, but it's alive in the present in some way. So that was kind of a mouthful, but that's to sort of give the general taste of how phenomenology would relate to any impactful event, including one that could be described as a religious experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I understood from that was that religious, maybe the religious domain or the religious dimension was already a given in your experience, or in many people's experience, it is a given. It is not something that, it wasn't something that was introduced, maybe you were introduced to in the same way that you were introduced to a scientific discipline.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I think because interestingly, it was given to me in its absence.
Oh.
And I want to explain a bit, because if you were to interview people engaged in any way in religious life, religious experience, whether in a scholarly sense or someone who's in an actual religious order, as a practitioner, or anywhere in between. For some of those people, you might find that their life story is one of having been seized by an event early in life. So it's the event that commands their attention and their being in a way, and then they respond to that. And I have good friends for whom that was exactly the case, right? And many even of the hagiographic stories you might find are sort of like that. You know, we go back historically.
Mhm.
Alternatively, there's some people for whom the possibility of religious experience in its absence is also experienced as a call.
As a call.
Yeah.
Not as a curiosity, not as a
Well, I'm choosing the word call or
Mhm.
vocation very
Interesting.
intentionally, actually, because I think that we could say curiosity, but that might be misunderstood as a kind of a merely theoretical or idle curiosity, even idle curiosity. And I think that if it were to be exclusively theoretical or something like that, then that would imply an attitude toward the divine or toward God, if that's what that means to you, that is, or to a religious experience, as a kind of spectator rather participant.
Right.
Or kind of an expert interest, like I want to become an expert in the varieties of like, let's say, an exclusively anthropological interest in which could go quite deep. So I'm not being dismissive about that, but it could be, and that was there for me too, in a way, as a young person, but a real fascination with what are the varieties of the different ways that people, different cultures and different periods in time have described these experiences. One could remain at the level of kind of an outside observer of such things for whom they are kind of very fascinating objects of interpretation. But object is the key word there.
So a kind of passive curiosity that one might have about how many people are living in that neighboring unit of the neighboring apartments. And my knowledge of it will not have any impact on them or on me other than that isolated piece of information. But let's say the call to find out something about a part of the world that might actually impact both that part of the world and have impact me, which is
yeah. I mean, one might even have a kind of a scholarly interest in a community of practice, of religious practice, that has an absolute impact on that community, while still not being a participant in it. And that could be great. I mean, again, I'm not being dismissive about that. So I for some reason, what comes to mind is kind of Assyrian Christians, for example, that community of Christianity in the Middle East. One could really become deeply fascinated by those little sort of smaller communities of Syriac or Assyrian Christians, without being part of that community of worship. And part of that interest might, as a scholar, let's say, might contribute to efforts to really recognize and preserve that inheritance, which culturally is a fascinating and I think really important one. So, you know, there's a whole, maybe I'm going down a rabbit hole a bit here, but I think the distinction I was making personally for myself was that it was not, that I would say vocation to be a participant and not just interest to be an observer of. That's kind of what
right.
Yeah.
Right. So when we kind of have a glimpse into that relationship that you described with religion, but we still don't know when phenomenology comes in and why it comes in. Why would it be useful to bring in that attitude, the phenomenological attitude?
Yeah, excellent question. I think I'm going to mention the Indian philosopher Jigendranath Mohanty in this context, because he's a great reference point for me in that he's widely respected as a scholar of Husserl's phenomenology in particular, but he's also done a great deal of scholarship on Indian philosophies. And he writes in the book, Phenomenology and Indian Philosophy, he has an essay in that book where he says that for him, he discovered that phenomenology was a great way of giving one access to the world of the other, whether it's the cultural other or whatever kind of other we're talking about. And he was speaking particularly in this cross-cultural context. And that's one reason. That's one way that phenomenology comes in. So there's that level of phenomenology as seeking to gain a kind of, I want to be careful about this, a kind of access to the intersubjective world of the other, the world in which they live, what the world looks like through the eyes of the other person. Not because one is in their head, this is not what phenomenology does, but because one is following, like Magnus Englander has written, following the experience of the other with enough fidelity that one gets a significant sense of what the world looks like for them. So that's one way in which it's important. The other, that's one way in which phenomenology is important in this context. And the other, I think, is the way in which, interestingly, all right, the headline is the way in which phenomenology gives the practitioner of phenomenologizing added ability to witness their own assumptive structure and start to discriminate between their pre-interpretations, which are usually not just personal ones, especially in terms of religion. It would also be collective interpretations, right? Cultural, historical, collective interpretations, communal interpretations, and begin to become more cognizant of how experiences are given and how they're interpreted, and with the distinction between the givenness and the interpretations beginning to stand out more. I'm not saying absolutely, because I want to be careful about not making too grandiose claims for anything, including phenomenology, but at least to distinguish between, for example, a traditional doctrine interpreting a particular kind of experience and the way that experience might be given to this community of people or this individual or me, myself. So there's that. And I'll sort of a footnote on Husserl again, that there is this idea in phenomenology of the witness or the disinterested witness. I sort of, this is a Husserlian term, that's a term in Husserl's phenomenology, is that aspect of consciousness, which is the witnessing consciousness. And that word will be immediately familiar to anyone who's engaged with, well, at minimum, just to take two examples, like Buddhist thought or classical Sufism. Both of them have, Sufism, as you know, has exactly that word. The witnessing, or mushahada, is a word that both means perception, but it literally also means witnessing, as you know. So that's a technical term in Sufism. So I'm not equating Husserl's use of that word with Buddhist uses of that idea, or of I'm not making fast and loose equations of these things, but there is, I would argue that there's some common thread there that bears looking into. And all of it implies a disengaging from being glued to the contents of consciousness. That's one of the common threads there.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me take a slight detour. I want to
Sure.
go in a different direction, but then return to what you said. The last time we spoke together, unfortunately, not a recorded conversation, but it was a private conversation, and you really made me realize something, that the natural attitude, the presence of natural attitude with respect to religion and religious experience can show up in two different ways. One is an overly sympathetic natural attitude that is totally immersed in religion and sees all the religious categories as just simply given as part of the world in which we live in. That's one natural attitude, as you said, glued to the content of consciousness. The other is, say, the kind of natural attitude that shows up in maybe a scientific or neuroscientist's attitude towards religion. They listen to a religious person describing their experience, and then they quietly, or maybe not quietly, translate the religious language into a neuroscientific hypothetical language. Right. Or say, okay, what you mean by that is really a kind of brain process. And what phenomenology enables, as you said, is a way of avoiding both of those attitudes.
Yeah, that's well put.
To repeat what you said, the first advantage or the first affordance of the phenomenology of religion would be a kind of access to the experience of the other, which implies that it is not initially, at least, my experience.
Mhm.
And the second is kind of renewal. It renews my, or the practitioners or phenomenologists' awareness of these categories at play. It's not too dissimilar to going into a different culture that enables us to become aware of, oh, these are cultural practices. For example, in every culture, there are these practices of doing things and saying things that don't have a literal meaning. They don't signify literally what the people are doing. But that's only apparent for people who are within the culture. So phenomenology of religion makes us aware of these categories that are already operative. Is that a fair way of reading?
Yeah, I'm sure that if we had like a good anthropologist with us right now, they could give a lot of other examples from outside of phenomenology that yield the same sort of insights. So I'm not claiming that phenomenologists are the only ones who think critically about those kind of categories,
Sure,
but that's
sure.
my way into it. So that's kind of what I'm speaking from. But yeah. And I think what you were touching on about the natural attitude or attitudes, probably it was plural for Husserl, and I think it is, but at least it is plural for me, because it's the naturalizing of whatever the life world or everyday attitude turns out to be, and the becoming, the kind of becoming naive in a natural way, becoming naive to the attitude of everyday life that I have, whatever my perspective is, including, as you pointed out, that of a sort of very thoughtful, analytical scientist, neuroscientist. Whatever my categories are, I can easily become naive to them being categories of interpretation in the first place. And therefore, I just start to label the world according to those buckets that I've become familiar with in my own mind, and become naive to my own hermeneutic. So I think that's what we're talking about, is not somehow avoiding that completely, but sort of waking up to that repeatedly over time, hopefully in dialogue with others, because to do this, I don't think any of this is solo, by the way. And that this overall dynamic, just again as a sort of a footnote, of becoming, of one's initially insightful ways of discriminating what we're seeing, becoming naive to those and naturalizing them or something like that, is something that Husserl is very much onto in The Crisis of European Sciences, in that book, when he discusses how the sciences tend to become techniques, tend to, I don't want to quite say degenerate, but to become technicized over time. So this, and then for him, the challenge was how to reawaken the originary meaning of those scientific practices and insights, so that one not lose sight of that. So it's a process of reawakening rather than, fatal flaw or something like that. I don't think it was avoidable from his point of view that would happen in science.
Should we now move on to this other question about religious experiences in general? What are religious experiences or phenomena? We can touch on this with the help of maybe William James.
Yeah, well, I did pull William James off the shelf last time we talked about this, and I could do that again if it's useful, because I think that's not a bad reference point. Yeah.
Sure.
This is the real life, right?
Yeah.
we do share this. This is how it goes, right?
Sounds good.
So, but yeah, I pulled James's varieties of religious experience off the shelf because he says early on in the book that for him, the way he's going to define religion for the purpose of this study is, and this is the quote, the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. And since that relation may be either moral, physical, or ritual, it's evident that out of religion in the sense of which we take it, theologies, philosophies, and ecclesiastical organizations may secondarily grow, he says. So therefore, he says, we're not going to really be talking about theology here. We're going back to the experiences of people themselves. And so that's a starting point. And it does parallel, as we also talked about before, Merleau-Ponty's observation that the world of science always rests on the foundation of the lived world, even if we sort of forget about that fact.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
And this having that in mind helped me read your article about this practice of remembrance. So remembrance as a way of being and maintaining a relationship with the divine. So there is this passage in the on page 25 where you say the relationship of the rememberer, the person who remembers, and the remembered, the one who is being remembered, is characterized by dynamism and mutuality. So this is a strange idea that the person who is remembering is also, by maintaining, by re-evoking this relationship, is also being remembered by the other. And this,
well, you jumped right into the core of the, the paper, which I'm happy about. But I think that if we do end up sharing this, I should probably say for our audience that what we're saying by remembrance here is the term is zikr or zikr.
Zikr. Mm-hmm.
Zikr, right? So, which is a term of practice in classical Sufism, or we could say Islam generally, for the remembrance of God. So that's so. And the paper that I wrote is sort of that's available online is a comparative study looking at classical literature about remembrance within Sufism, and then a phenomenological interpretation of that practice of remembrance from the perspective mostly of Husserl and Fink. So that's what I'm doing in that paper, just to give people the context.
Sure. Sorry if I jumped in too quickly.
No, not at all. But the one being remembered in the practice of zikr is God.
Right.
So that's the context that paper is talking about. Yeah, back to you. Yeah.
I really the reason why I appreciate and I feel excited by this treatment of basically human being is its strangeness and how far we are now in our current thinking about this way of remembering. For us, remembering is just something that intentional relationship is something between the mind that is not really being affected by the reality which it remembers. That sense of being oriented is unique to religious discourse. Sense of what I'm thinking about or what I'm doing, what I'm practicing implicates me. It draws me in, and that's the reason why I'm doing it. That's why I'm engaged in it.
Right.
As opposed to a relatively passive attitude that sustains an ultimately inconsequential relationship, relatively inconsequential relationship that is non-religious. I hope that strangeness is now a little bit more familiar to our
right.
Listeners.
Well, I mean, it's so much is implicated, right, in what you're opening up now, because for one thing, the way remembrance is used in classical Sufism, it's a practice that at its depth is intended to yield a whole series of shifts of being. I mean, deep shifts. So it's in other words, like scholars would say that the word zikr in classical Sufism is somewhere between meditation, what we would call meditation, and prayer. It's sort of in that territory between, somewhat between, like it depends on the scholarly perspective. So in other words, it's not the way that this word remembrance, which to us sounds like, oh yeah, what's my friend's phone number? We're not talking about that kind of remembrance of just everyday remembering of a fact. So it's not a fact that's being remembered in the narrow sense of a fact that I possess. It's a reality that's being remembered, which is ontological, which will yield an experience of who is the owner of the activity of remembering in the first place. That's where this goes in the meditative literature of classical Sufism. So the claim and people like Sal Tustari or Kushairi or Ibn al-Arabi would be that at the depth of the so-called practice of remembrance is the experience that that it is God who remembers and who is remembering, sort of maybe through that person. So I mean, all of this, and this is where phenomenology comes back in. So for us right now, or for me right now, so I am describing this to you and to any possible audience, not as a fact, right? I'm not making that statement of God being the rememberer as a fact that people should either accept or not accept as factual. I'm describing it within brackets as that's what's reported within the tradition. That we have people within the tradition, like Kushairi himself, saying this is the experience of what it is, what remembrance is, where it goes. So as a phenomenologist, if I'm taking that role, I'm in a sense listening to the other and saying, okay, this person is reporting this quality of experience in the practice of remembrance. And this raises lots of hermeneutic questions as well, almost immediately, because this is happening within a cultural and hermeneutic context full of assertions and assumptions and beliefs about who, about God, about the relationship of the human being to God, but the whole backstory, is there. What's the proper relationship that one should have with God? That's there's a whole world of thought, practice, and art around that within the Islamic world. So anyhow, I guess the reason I bring in the hermeneutic part of it is that also the ways in which it's traditionally acceptable to talk about that relationship, and the ways in which it's traditionally forbidden or unacceptable to talk about it, or even to imagine it. So, I mean, any religious tradition we could probably think about would have its parameters of acceptable and unacceptable in any context, right? So this isn't particular to Islam, strictly speaking, but there are huge debates within Islam, within the history of Islam, which included dire consequences for plenty of Sufis who went beyond what was considered beyond the pale from the mainstream of society in terms of how this relationship was meant to be understood. And Hallaj, Mansur al-Hallaj, is probably the most famous example of that.
Yeah, that's exactly I was just remembering him. Hallaj,
sure. Well, you would be.
What he said, so what he said was, I am the truth, and al-haq. And
right.
That's the summary of an entire philosophy that was beyond the bounds of acceptable statements.
There's a huge debate over how to contextualize, how to understand that. That was within plenty of debate about that. And so we've now gone really deep down now, like into the rabbit hole, as far as anyone not already really acquainted with Sufism won't be tracking any of this, but that's okay. But because I think the important part is that I think to point out that when we get into phenomenology of religious experience at any depth, there is a history. If we're looking at particularly if we're looking at a tradition that has deep historical roots, and there's no avoiding all of these kinds of issues. I think it's part of it. Part of it.
Yeah. Marc, unfortunately, we are out of time for this conversation. Hopefully, we'll continue. We'll pick it up in the near future. So thank you very much. Let me stop the recording and then